Hey, what up, y'all? I am Lou, and today we're going to be talking about Python virtual environments. What is a virtual environment? Why should you use a virtual environment? So we're going to kind of discuss those topics, right? And those of y'all who have been programming in Python for a while, this may not necessarily be something um, useful, I guess, overall, because you're probably using it already, so it's nothing new. But there's a lot of new programmers, right? There's a lot of new Python programmers, and some of the things that I have been seeing, because I have had people reach out to me to help them out with some of their code base or some of their issues. And one of the things that I noticed when I look at some of the logs, some of the error messages or whatever, I'm able to kind of determine their interpreter, like their Python environment that they're using. Um, and I'm noticing that it seems like they're testing projects or creating projects using the interpreter that's installed on their main machine. And honestly, that's a big no-no, man. I strongly recommend not to do that. So, but for those of y'all who may not be aware of, we're gonna talk about why you shouldn't, why you should create environments and how to use it, like how to actually create it, how to activate it, how to use it, how to deactivate it, and so on. And what's the difference? What's the difference of a virtual environment compared to the interpreter environment, right? The environment that you have on your local PC. So we'll talk about all of those aspects of it as well. Um, I appreciate it if you give me a thumbs up if you enjoy the video. Give me a follow. Also, one of the things that I'm doing every Friday night, I have a series called Drinking with Lou, and it's literally that, right? I'm gonna be drinking. I'm gonna be testing out new tequilas, new bourbons, whiskeys, because that's the drink of my choice. And as we drink, we'll talk tech. Whether it be Python, we could review Python code if you have any Python code that you want to review. Against it's all live, so we'll actually review your code base. I will try to fix it or try to solve some problems that you have live as I'm streaming. Um, and again, well, that's kind of the plan, right? If you do have any questions, issues, we'll review. If not, we're just gonna talk code, and we're gonna be drinking. So I'll be testing a new tequila this Friday, and I'll talk about that as well. But we'll be drinking and talking about code. So if you're interested, again, it'll be Friday at 9 p.m. Central through 11 p.m. Central. That's the time frame. All right, guys. So let's go ahead and get started. So when you initially install Python, most of y'all who are using Python already should know how to do that already, because you're using Python, so it's pretty straightforward. Now, the purpose of a virtual environment, or let me just kind of give you a concept of what is the virtual environment doing. Think of it as, and as I talk about it, let me share my screen, and then I'll kind of show you just a diagram of what at least in my mind, what I'm thinking, right? So whenever you install Python, and I'm gonna just call this Python, let's say 3.9, right? So let's say that's what you have installed. Oops. Okay, so you got Python 3.9 installed. And when you're gonna work on a project, let's say you're gonna build a web app, and the web app you're gonna be using Django, and whatever other packages that come along with it, right? Because when you install Django, there will probably be some dependencies involved. If you're building a crude application, which is again is going to be creating records, reading, deleting, so on, editing records in the database, or you're going to need to have some sort of database package, right? Whether it be PyODBC, whether it be there's a SQL Server package if you're connecting to a SQL Server database, whatever it may be, right? But you're going to need these other packages involved. Well, what happens is, what you do not want to do is this Python 3.9 interpreter that you installed from python.org. That's being saved. Think of it on your main window, right? It's your main interpreter that's on your Windows, um, that has been installed to utilize. You don't want to install all of your package on that environment. What you want to do is, and maybe what I'll do, I'll call this, just for now, I'll call this main environment, right? So just so we know, this is the main environment. What you want to do, this is where, virtual environment comes in. Did I spell it? I probably spelled it wrong, but that's fine. You know what I'm talking about, right? So it's fine. So you have your virtual environment, and ultimately what you do when you create a virtual environment, think of it as you're taking a clone. You're literally cloning this interpret this environment that you have. You're cloning it. So I mean, it's going to take up space. So you're literally taking a copy of that environment, right? And this is your clone. But now on this virtual environment, you can now install these other external packages, right? You could install your Django, right, and your PYODBC, whatever it is that you're using, right? Whatever the packages are that you're using, all of that will get installed under this environment. And by doing that, what this ultimately does is, now you keep this, what I want to call pure and clean, which means this version of Python is pretty much the same version of what it was when you installed it initially, right? There has not been any new packages added to it, none of that. It's strictly the original version. So now going forward, as you work on different projects, let's say this environment here, because it's a web app, you got Django and whatever other projects. This is going to be for, it's your virtual environment for, let's say, I'm going to call it web app 1, right? It's for a web app, all right? Now, when you the package that, let's say, that you install on here, let's say you're dealing with Django, what is it, like 3.1. I don't know what version of PYODBC it is out there, but let's kind of pick a version right quick. So let's say you're dealing with release 20 on this one. All right, that's fine. You test it out, you build your app on this, everything works fine. So let's say a few months later, you're gonna build another web app, but this time the web app that you're gonna build, you have determined you're not using Django 3.1. You want to use the latest Django, which would be Django 4, the 4.2, or I'm trying to think what's the latest version of Django. But so let's say you create another app. So you're going to create a new virtual environment, right? This is your second one, and this is going to be for your web app 2, right? Your second app. It's still using Python 3.9, that's fine, but the difference is you're using Django 4.0, and let's say your PYODBC is version 23, release 23, whatever that version number ends up being. So now you're dealing with different versions of the packages, and by having a virtual environment, you're able to keep these separated. All right, that's fine. So by doing this, what it allows you to do is now you keep your main environment, the one that you install from python.org, if that's where you got it from. You're able to keep that pure and clean without really touching it, adding on to it. And then from there, you create clones, right? Think of it, that's kind of what it is. You're creating a clone for this version. Then you're creating a clone of this of the core of the Python environment, because you haven't added on to it, you haven't manipulated, you haven't done none of that. It's literally taking a copy of the core environment, And then after you take a copy of it, then you could add your other packages that may be more version specific. And this is key because when anytime what happens here, if I were to use this same environment here for my second web app over here, and let's say I would upgrade Django 3.1 of 4.0, well, there's going to be changes from 3.1 of 4.0 within Django. And if I were to upgrade that, well, what would happen or end up happening is whenever I run my web app 1, I may end up getting all kinds of errors. Things may end up breaking because there's portions of the Django, framework, like the Python code that relates to the Django framework that changed from version 3.1 of 4.0. And because it changed, it will break now. Now my second web app will work fine, but my first web app would break potentially, right? I'm not. I mean, most likely it would break if things drastically change, especially from maybe they got rid of certain functions, or maybe they consolidated certain classes, or whatever it is that they changes they have done from 3.1 to 4.0. That would ultimately mean this could break. So in order to avoid that, what you do is you create a second virtual environment. When you create a second virtual environment, now you could install a fresh version of Django, which in this case will be 4.0 if you want that newer version. And then also, whatever version of, whatever other packages you're installing, you could specify whatever version that works best for that application. And you could ultimately repeat this process many times. Let's say you have a web app 3. Well, that one you may want, right? So let's say we're going to do web app 3, right? This is our third web app. All right, so we have a third web app. And let's say for this guy, we're like, dude, I'm actually working on an old code base for a client, but I need to test it out, do some development. And they're using Django 2.11, right? An old version of Django. That's what they're using. They're using whatever release 15. I mean, again, whatever version they're using. That may happen, right? Especially if you start doing development work for clients, for their current application, which could be using an older version of it. Unless you're going to upgrade it to a newer version of Django, which most likely probably not, because most clients would be more like, hey, if it's not broken, don't fix it, let it be. But if you're doing updates, like maybe some new enhancements, some new features that the client wants, this is a good example where you're going to have to install an older version of Django, right, to kind of accommodate that. And again, in order to do that, that's where your virtual environment comes in, because the last thing you want to do is have all of the different Django versions all in your main environment. It's going to cause all kinds of issues, man. It's going to be a mess. So for that reason, I don't ever recommend installing anything on your main environment. I'm not saying that you can't do it, because you can. I mean, it's going to let you do it unless it's something that it's very specific, or let's say if it's more something like a Raspberry Pi, and that Raspberry Pi only running one application on it only, like some kind of script, and it requires a few packages. Maybe in that case, if you're pretty certain that under no circumstance nothing else is going to run, okay, you could install those packages if you want, technically on the main environment. There won't be any issues. But when you're doing development work, you as a developer, you're going to be working on different projects, new projects, maybe existing projects, things of that level. In order to manage it, that's where virtual environment is very, very important. And you got to separate it, man, because you're going to cause all kinds of messiness to your projects. So that's why you want to do it. This is one of the reasons why you want to create a virtual environment. I'm hoping the visual helps out those of you who are new on the reasoning why you want to create a virtual environment, right? So that being said, let's go ahead and let me walk you through on how to do it. All right, sorry guys, I just noticed right now I wasn't sharing my screen, so I'm gonna actually go through this again. since I wasn't sharing my screen. All right, so what I want to show you is when you go to your terminal, if you're to type in Python, hit enter, it's going to tell you which version of Python you activated. In this case, it's 3.11. Now you could have multiple Python versions installed on your machine. That you could have Python 3.8, 3.9, 3.11, all installed on one machine. And the way you would access those would be different. It all depends on how it's set up. You know, for example, in some cases it could be in order to access 3.8, you put 3.8. In order to access 3.9, you put 3.9. And maybe Python by itself is accessing 3.11 because that's how it's set up, right? So if it's set up that way, I think most people that I'm aware of, not all, but most people seem to really just kind of work under one environment for the most half. If they upgrade Python from like 3.8 to 3.10, I think in most cases they're not really flip-flopping back. It's kind of like, you know, they stick to 3.10 because for the most half you could do everything that you could do in 3.11. If anything, they're part of some new features in the most cases, right? Most cases, not all the time, but in most cases. Either way, so in order to create a virtual environment, I'm going to type Python -m v for virtual and then environment. So this v environment, it comes part of Python and ultimately allows you to install not install, but to set up virtual environments. And then on top of that, I got to specify the name of my environment. So in my case, I'm going to call it environment 1, right? So I just do that. I'm going to go ahead and run it. It takes a few seconds. There it goes. It's done now. So now if I go back to my folder, we have an environment here. And then you open it up, it's going to look almost identical to your Python environment that you have on your Windows machine. So if you have not looked at it, take a look at it. It's going to look very similar. And ultimately you have this libs and site package. This is the piece here that's going to be very unique for your machine only. So this is where you could install packages that only exist for this environment, not in your main your Python environment that's installed on your, you know, on your PC. So let me go back. So now that we created a environment, let's go ahead and activate the environment. So in order to activate it, it's source, specify the folder of the environment, scripts, and then activate, right? So by doing this, then you'll see, you know, I could tell here environment 1. Now that environment has been activated. So I'm in that environment. So whatever I do, it's part of that environment. So in my case, I'm going to install Django. What version did I say I was going to install? All right, so I'm going to install version 4.0. Oops. 0.2. You know what? I think, yeah, I'm assuming this is the Y. Nope. What's going on here? I forgot to put 2 equal sign. Damn it. All right. So it's Django equals then whatever version you're trying to install. In my case, 4.0.2. So let's get that installed. As you could tell, there are these other packages that are being installed: SQL parse, TZ data. So there's other stuff that's, you know, dependencies that needs to be installed. So it actually installed a few packages, not just Django, but probably 3 other packages. All right. Let's say, for example, well, you know what? That's fine. I have this installed. So what I'm going to do now is, as you work on a project and you have packages installed in your environment, there's something called freeze. Freeze is a requirements text file that you could export out, and ultimately will list all of the packages that exist for that environment. So for example, I'm going to do pip freeze requirements.text. So what this did, we look back here in the back. Let me go ahead and open it up. These are the 4 packages that got installed right now on that environment. And that's all it did. I exported this out. The reason why you export this out is anytime you work on a project, you want to provide the versions, the package versions in your environment. So anybody else uses it, they could install those same versions to make sure that everybody's working on the same, you know, on pretty much everybody on the same page, right? As you have other team members working on your code. But as you can see, this is Django 4.0. We have these other packages that we're dealing with, which works fine. So now what I'm going to do here is, so what we did right now is just kind of go back to the top. We created a environment, which is step 1, right? We created the environment. The environment that it created was Python 3.11. After I created the environment, I activated the environment. This is how you activate it. Source. Then you got to specify the folder wherever the environment is at, scripts, and then activate. After I activate it, then I could install packages to this environment. In this case, it's Python, you know, install Django 4.0. Then of course this by default installed a few other packages, as we saw, right? 3 other packages. So now this environment has Python 3.11 with 4 packages installed as well. Now that I'm in it, I could use it, right? If I were to say Python, well, let's say if I have a Python file, I could run that Python file and it's going to run fine, because it's, you know, as long as there's no conflict. Like if I'm running code and my file that I'm running happens to be code for, let's say, Django 2.11 or something, then there could be issues there because things have changed from Django 4.0 to 2.11. But again, that's the whole purpose of having different versions. So, but let's say now that now that you're in here, you will run a Python script like normal, right? You got your environment activated. Let me just kind of create a, I guess let me open up Visual Studio real quick. So let's say, for example, I'm going to create a file and we'll just call it test.py, right? You know, test.py. And let's say in here I'm going to do, I don't have any Django code on me right now to run, but let me go back. Let me add another package. One of the packages I'm going to add on here is going to be install requests. So the request package, as you can tell, there's a lot of other stuff being installed. This is what you would use to call, whether it be an API, whether it be a URL, things of that nature, right? Pretty much it's HTTP related, you know, to call those kind of protocols. So that's kind of what this package is used. Now, let's say if I create a file, and this file I'm going to import in request. Oops, did I spell it right? Nope. I'm going to import in request. So let me save it. Let me also do, let's see, let me do URL. I don't know, let me just specify a URL. And let me do print request get URL, right? So let's just do something basic like that, right? So if I were to run this test, so see how I got this response 200? That means I called that URL and I was able to access it. Like it connected to google.com, and it was a successful, there was a successful communication back, and I got a response of 200, which means it was successful, right? Which is good. So let me, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to deactivate that environment, but now I'm going to create a second environment, right? The second environment that I'm going to create, I'm going to call this environment 2. Okay. So now we have a second environment. I'm going to go ahead now and activate the second environment. Alright, and now that I have the second environment activated, I am going to only install Django, but I'm going to install a older version. Now in this case, it doesn't even matter if I install the newer version. You know what, for the purpose of this example, let's go ahead and install the same version, right? Just to make sure there's no confusion. Same version of Django, right? I'm going to install same version of Django. Let it run. Again, those other 3 packages are being installed as well, which is fine. Okay. So now, though, the only thing that this environment does not have that the environment 1 has is this request package. So if I were to try to run test file, boom, I get an error message. And if you look at the error message, it's saying no module name request. That makes sense, right? This makes total sense because, again, let me go ahead and deactivate this. Then I'm going to activate so event, yeah, environment 1. And now if I run the same thing, Python test 1, boom, it works. So as we could see, when I run that script, when I run this test py script under the environment 2, it doesn't work. And the reason why it doesn't work is because the request environment has not been installed. When I run environment 1, request package is installed, and because it's installed, it's able to import it in and it's able to use it. And this is how you separate your projects, right? As you work on different projects, like normally you wouldn't have 2 environments for one project. I just did this for a test. The more realistic thing would be you're working on this web app, right? Let's just call it web app 1. That would have its own packages. And then you work on web app 2, and that would have its own packages. Because there's a good chance that they're not using the same version of packages. This one could be using Django, 4.0, while this other one using an old version of Django, like 2.11. Like, again, that does happen, especially when you're working on older source code, like code bases that already exist. You're updating. You're not building from scratch. When you're building from scratch, you can use a newer version that's out there. But when you're updating a specific version, most likely that's not the case, unless the request is to bring their code up to date, like update the packages. But most of the time that's not the case, and there's a good chance that the client probably be like, no, it works, I just want to add a feature. Like in their mind, they're not thinking about upgrading the package. But as again, we saw in this example, it worked on one environment, but it didn't on the other one. And that's because one environment has that package and the other environment does not have the package. So if I were to freeze, right, so let's go ahead and freeze this again. So let me now deactivate, and I'm going to reactivate environment 2, and I'm going to do a freeze as well on this environment. But this one I'm going to call it requirements 2, right? Just so we kind of see the difference. Let me freeze that. So now we come over here, we take a look at both of these. There it goes. As you could tell, these have the same packages, when it comes to Django, when it comes, these other ones, the difference is this one has a request package and this one does not, which is why when I activate this environment, which is the environment one, it works. It's able to run that test Python script. But when I activate environment two, it does not work. I get an error message because that package doesn't exist. So hopefully this gives you a good example of how environments are pretty much isolated from each other, right? They don't interfere with your main Python environment. If anything, all it's doing is getting a clone version of it. It clones it, and then once you clone it and you save it on whatever folder you want to save it to, it doesn't have to be saved under the same paths of your main Python environment. You save it on whatever you want to save it to, and then now you'll be able to install whatever packages relate to your project that you're working on there. Strongly recommend to do that, man. This should be one of those practices that it's like, even if you're just testing files or working on basic stuff, if you're just writing scripts that doesn't require any packages, they don't need a clone Python for that. But if you're working on projects where it requires these additional packages to be installed, always, man, create a new environment. Simple as that. Strongly recommend it. I'm a big believer of using environments. Strongly recommend all of y'all to do it. I mean, hopefully this video helps out those who are new, who are trying to understand, like, what is environments? How does that work? Like, why do I need to use it? What's the purpose behind it? Hopefully what I showed you helps out. I mean, that's my goal and my plan anyways, that it helps you out. And if you like it, you know, give me a thumbs up, give me a follow. I'm trying to share my knowledge with y'all, help y'all out, and hopefully help somebody out. And if you like it, again, give me a thumbs up. Appreciate it. Peace.